The German engineers could hardly believe what they were seeing. In the frozen air of a captured Soviet testing yard, the temperature had dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Their own trucks and tanks sat dead in the snow, their engines frozen solid, their oil turned to sludge. Yet before them, under a thin layer of frost, a Soviet T-34 tank rumbled to life, effortlessly. Its diesel heart growled low and steady, smoke billowing from the exhaust like the breath of a living creature. The year was 1942, deep in the Russian winter. The Wehrmacht had advanced farther than any army before it, but nature had turned against them. Their mighty panzers, so effective in the fields of France, were failing on the steppes. Engines cracked, fuel lines burst, and men froze beside their machines. German command needed answers. How could the Soviets keep fighting in such impossible conditions? To find out, they captured several T-34s near Rozhov and transported them to an engineering station behind the lines. There, in a makeshift facility filled with cold and disbelief, German technicians stripped down the tanks piece by piece. What they found inside changed their understanding of tank design forever. The T-34's engine, the V2 diesel, was unlike anything they had built. Cast from aluminum alloy, it was lighter and more efficient than the gasoline engines powering German armor. While their Maybach engines required constant maintenance and preheating in the cold, the T-34's diesel block shrugged off the frost like it was nothing. Even in temperatures where oil became tar, the Soviet machine started without complaint. When the Germans pored over the blueprints and components, they were struck by its balance of simplicity and sophistication. It wasn't elegant like German engineering. It wasn't refined, but it worked every single time. The air filters were crude yet effective, the cooling system rugged and well-designed, the fuel delivery system brilliantly resilient to freezing. Every component seemed to have been built with one purpose: to survive the Russian winter. That morning, one German engineer, a man who had worked on the Maybach HL-230 engine used in the Tiger tank, stood by the T-34's running engine, his breath turning to mist. He shook his head slowly. "It is not beautiful," he muttered, "but it is unstoppable." The test went on for hours. The T-34 idled, revved, cooled, and restarted without a single failure. Oil temperature rose evenly. Fuel lines did not freeze. The Germans watched as mechanics splashed icy water over the block, then started it again minutes later with the same steady roar. The engine seemed to mock them, a machine that refused to die, just like the Red Army it powered. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's engineers began to understand the secret of Soviet success. The Russians didn't build tanks for performance, they built them for survival. Their machines were designed not for the showroom, but for the battlefield, for mud, ice, and blood. That night, as snow fell thick outside the testing shed, the T-34's exhaust pipe still glowed faintly red. The German officers took notes in silence, their pride wounded, their curiosity piqued. Somewhere beyond the frozen forests, more of these tanks were roaring to life, thousands of them. And as they watched the captured T-34 idle in the dark, a chilling realization settled over the room. The Soviet Union had not just built a tank, they had built a weapon that could outlast winter itself. When dawn broke over the testing yard, the world outside was a white wasteland. The wind carried fine shards of ice that cut at the skin like glass. A thermometer nailed to the shed wall read, minus 31 degrees Celsius. Yet from within, the deep rumble of the T-34's diesel engine broke the silence again. Steady, unwavering, alive. The German engineers, wrapped in greatcoats and scarves, gathered around the tank with clipboards and notebooks. They had drained the oil overnight, filled the cooling system with freezing water, and left the fuel tank exposed to the wind. By every rule of mechanical logic, they knew this machine should not start. But the T-34 defied them again. The starter groaned once, then the engine caught, roaring to life as if it were a summer morning. The lead engineer, Oberingenieur Carl Thompson, leaned close to the exhaust. The heat was immediate, the fumes thick and oily. He muttered to his colleagues that even aircraft engines struggled in this cold. Yet this Soviet design had shrugged it off. When they tested their own Panzer IV in similar conditions, It took hours of preheating torches and field improvisations just to coax the engine into turning over. The difference was staggering. The secret they discovered was in the diesel itself. The Soviet 5.2 engine ran on fuel that was far less volatile than gasoline, reducing the risk of fire and improving reliability in freezing conditions. The combustion was slower, steadier, like the beating of a great iron heart. It was simple chemistry, but it had changed the outcome of battles. They removed the engine panels and examined the interior. Everything inside was built for endurance. Wide tolerances, self-priming fuel pumps, and a robust cooling system that resisted cracking even in the frost. Nothing looked refined. The casting marks were rough, the welds uneven, the bolts oversized. But that crudeness was its genius. German machinery required precision maintenance. One loose bolt and the system faltered. The T-34, by contrast, tolerated imperfection. It didn't care about elegance. It cared about survival. As the day went on, the engineers ran a series of stress tests. They poured snow directly into the air intakes, replaced the oil with a partially frozen mixture, and even disconnected the battery for hours before trying to restart it. Each time, the T-34 refused to fail. Its twin air filters rattled, its pistons hammered, and the machine kept running. At midday, an officer from the Wehrmacht's Technical Bureau arrived to observe the experiment. He had come expecting confirmation of German superiority, a report that would explain away Soviet success as a fluke of numbers or luck. Instead, he found his men staring at the idling tank like it was a creature from another world. One of the engineers, still stunned, reported the findings. "The Russians have built an engine for hell itself," he said quietly. "It needs no care. It laughs at the cold." The officer frowned. "So they are lucky?" The engineer shook his head. "No, they are practical. We build machines that impress. They build machines that win outside." Snow continued to fall over the wreckage of frozen German vehicles lined along the road. Panzers stood silent, their hatches sealed with ice, engines dead since the night before. Only the T-34 lived, its exhaust plume curling upward like a defiant banner against the winter sky. That evening, when the German engineers shut down their equipment and prepared their reports, they all wrote the same thing at the top of their pages. T-34 operates flawlessly under extreme conditions. But in private, they wrote something else. A note they wouldn't dare include in the official documentation. If this is how their machines endure, then how will we ever stop them? The next morning, the frost was even thicker. The engineers awoke to find their own vehicles buried under snowdrifts, their engines solid with ice. Soldiers lit fires beneath the oil pans, a desperate trick to melt the frozen lubricant, while others hammered at the tracks with spades. Yet when they trudged to the shed where the T-34 sat, the Soviet tank waited silently, a gray beast half buried in snow, but untouched by the cold. They brushed the frost from its hatches and turned the starter. Within seconds, the engine growled back to life. The exhaust belched black smoke, melting the snow in a widening circle around the tank. To the German engineers, it was almost supernatural, a machine built to breathe fire in a world of ice. They decided to document everything: the oil temperature, the air pressure, the fuel viscosity, every parameter that could explain the impossible. But the results kept coming back the same: stable, consistent, reliable. It didn't matter how long the tank sat in sub-zero temperatures, it always started. When they inspected the internal components again, the truth began to dawn on them. The T-34's engine wasn't just durable, it was brilliantly designed for simplicity and maintenance. Parts were interchangeable, easy to remove, and quick to replace even in the field. One mechanic could service it alone, using tools carried inside the tank itself. No complex procedures, no fragile fittings. It was an engineer's nightmare of elegance and a soldier's dream of survival. They compared it to their own Maybach HL-120 and HL-230 engines, marvels of precision engineering that demanded constant attention. Those German power plants were masterpieces of craftsmanship, but they were fragile, high-strung, and utterly unsuited to the Russian front. The Maybachs needed clean fuel, fine-tuned carburetors, and warm starts. The T-34's diesel would run on whatever fuel the crew could find. If the filter clogged, they hit it with a wrench. If the coolant froze, they poured in water and waited. The engine didn't care. It just kept working. By midday, word of the tests had spread through the nearby German command post. Officers and technicians arrived one by one, curious to see the invincible Soviet tank. Some came skeptically, others reluctantly. They circled the machine like hunters around a captured animal, touching its armor, peering into the engine bay. The Germans were accustomed to mechanical perfection, tight tolerances, precision machining, beauty in design. What they saw here offended that instinct. The weld seams were crude, the fittings uneven, the controls primitive. It was as though the T-34 had been forged in a factory that didn't care about appearance. And yet, against all logic, it was better, tougher, more forgiving, and above all, unstoppable. When they tested fuel consumption, the results were equally startling. The diesel engine burned less fuel than their gasoline models, yet produced enough power to move the tank faster over rough terrain. Even in deep snow, the T-34 glided forward, its broad tracks spreading the weight evenly. For hours, they ran it back and forth, over ice ridges and frozen ditches, expecting the suspension to seize or the gearbox to crack. But it didn't. The tank's wide tracks clawed through the snow, its engine steady as ever. When they finally stopped it for the night, steam rose from its exhaust like a living breath in the Arctic air. The lead engineer, Thompson, stood beside the machine long after the others left. Snowflakes melted against the warm hull, hissing softly as they disappeared. He realized with a kind of reluctant awe that the Soviets had built not just a tank for war, but a machine perfectly tuned to their land, their weather, and their will to survive. Somewhere far to the east, more engines like this one were roaring to life, thousands of them waiting for spring. And as Thompson turned away, he knew that when the thaw came, those engines would be moving west. The following week, the German engineers received new orders from Berlin. The captured T-34 and its engine were to be transported back to a secure testing facility in Kummersdorf, near Berlin. It was a site where the Reich's finest minds examined enemy technology, aircraft, weapons, and now the Soviet tank that refused to die. Getting it there, however, was another matter. The roads were frozen solid, and the transport trucks kept breaking down in the cold. Ironically, it was the T-34 that ended up helping haul one of the disabled German trucks free of a snowdrift. The soldiers watching laughed uneasily. The captured tank was proving more useful than their own machines. When the T-34 finally arrived in Germany, it drew a crowd. Engineers, officers, and industry representatives from firms like Daimler-Benz and Maybach lined up to study it. They examined every bolt, every weld, every inch of the V2 diesel engine. Some dismissed it as crude, calling it peasant engineering. But others saw something different, something genius in its simplicity. They began the tests again, this time under controlled conditions. They froze it, heated it, drained it, refueled it, and ran it for hours at full throttle. Every time the results were the same, it kept running. At one point, they even replaced the oil with a thick, partially congealed mix and left it overnight. In the morning, it started on the first try. German technicians were baffled. They had spent years refining their engines, perfecting tolerances to a fraction of a millimeter. Yet here was a machine built in rough Soviet factories, by laborers working under air raids, and it was outperforming them. It seemed to thrive on neglect, to embrace chaos. One engineer wrote in his report, "This engine operates under conditions that would destroy ours in minutes. It is not delicate, it is alive." The V2's secret was its design philosophy. Soviet engineers, led by Konstantin Chelpin years earlier, had deliberately built an engine that could survive extreme heat, cold, and dirt. It used coarse filtration that tolerated dust rather than trying to eliminate it. Its aluminum construction, though unconventional, reduced weight without compromising strength. And its diesel nature meant less risk of fire and better torque at low speeds, critical for maneuvering over the frozen steppes. At Kummersdorf, the German experts compared it directly with their own Maybach HL230, the powerhouse of the Tiger. The contrast was stunning. The Maybach produced more horsepower, but it required constant care. clean fuel, trained mechanics, and warm conditions. The T-34's engine, by contrast, could be started by almost anyone, anywhere. It was not stronger, it was smarter. After days of trials, one senior officer overseeing the test reportedly remarked, "This engine was built by men who expected to fight in hell." By this point in the war, the Germans were beginning to feel the consequences of their own engineering pride. Their factories could no longer produce the precise components their designs required. Their tanks, magnificent on paper, were suffering breakdowns in the field from overcomplexity. Meanwhile, the Soviets, using designs like the T-34, were building thousands of tanks a month, fast, rugged, and ready for any climate. When news of the test reached the front, it spread quietly among tank crews. Some refused to believe it. Others already knew. They had seen T-34s push through snowdrifts and frozen rivers that would have trapped a panther. They had watched Soviet armor arrive on the battlefield when their own machines were frozen solid. The engineers' reports only confirmed what soldiers at the front had already learned in blood and snow. The T-34 was the perfect machine for the Russian war. And back in the lab at Kummersdorf, as the V-2 engine idled through yet another sub-zero night, one German mechanic murmured under his breath that it didn't just start in the cold, it belonged there. By February 1943, the engineers at Kummersdorf had finished their official evaluations, but the T-34's engine had become something of an obsession. Even after the formal tests ended, they kept it running, day after day, night after night, to see if they could finally make it fail. It never did. They ran it dry of oil. They filled it with low-grade diesel mixed with water. They started it after freezing it for days, then overheated it under full throttle for hours. Every time the V-2 coughed, sputtered, and then settled into its steady, guttural rhythm. The German mechanics, hardened professionals who had worked on everything from Panzer engines to aircraft power plants, began referring to it half-jokingly as Das Biest, the beast. At first, Berlin had intended the study to prove German superiority. Instead, it had done the opposite. Reports from the Kummersdorf facility described the T-34's engine as crude but unkillable. One analyst even suggested that Germany should consider building a similar diesel engine for its own tanks, an idea quickly dismissed by senior officers who still viewed diesel power as too agricultural. Pride and ideology would not allow imitation, no matter how effective the design proved. Meanwhile, the engineers couldn't ignore the lessons staring them in the face. The T-34's V-2 wasn't advanced by accident. It was the product of necessity, an engine forged for a country that expected no mercy from nature or its enemies. Its wide pistons, low compression ratios, and simple injection system were deliberate choices. Where the Maybach required precision calibration and clean fuel, the Soviet diesel could devour whatever the front lines had on hand. One afternoon, Thompson, the senior engineer, arranged an informal demonstration for a group of visiting officers. They stood outside the hangar, the air biting at their faces, watching as two vehicles, a Panzer IV and the captured T-34, were started in the open cold. The Panzer crew worked frantically, heating oil pans with torches and hammering at frozen joints. The T-34's Soviet mechanic, who had been captured and forced to assist in the tests, simply flipped a few switches and cranked the starter. Within seconds, the engine rumbled to life. The German officers exchanged uneasy glances. The sound of that diesel growl, steady and sure in the sub-zero wind, carried a quiet humiliation. What made it worse was that this wasn't a fluke. Reports from the Eastern Front confirmed it. While German tanks sat immobilized in the snow, Soviet armor kept moving. In the retreats near Rzhov and the counterattacks around Stalingrad, T-34s had rolled through frozen rivers, snowfields, and mud-choked roads without stopping. It wasn't that they were indestructible. They broke down like all machines. But they started again, again, and again. In one intercepted Soviet field report, a Red Army tank commander described how his crew had buried their T-34 overnight under snow to camouflage it from Luftwaffe scouts. When dawn came, they dug it out, kicked the starter once, and drove straight into combat. No preheating, no repairs, no prayers, just movement. Back at Kummersdorf, the engineers realized that the T-34's endurance was part of something larger. an entire design philosophy alien to German thinking. The Soviets built for war, not prestige. Their machines were rough, yes, but every flaw served a purpose. Bolts could be tightened with any wrench. Panels could be replaced in minutes. If a tank broke down, a farmhand turned tanker could fix it. As the test came to an end, Thomson compiled his final report. He described the V2 as a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. He recommended further study, but he knew it would never happen. Berlin wanted weapons of perfection, not practicality. When he signed the last page, he paused, listening to the low, even thrum of the T-34 engine echoing through the hall one last time. It sounded like defiance. Outside, the winter wind howled across the fields, and for the first time, Thomson wondered if this unassuming machine from the East, was the real reason Germany would lose the war. Spring came slowly to Germany that year. The snow melted into gray slush, and the fields around Kummersdorf filled with mud. Most of the engineers moved on to new projects: jet propulsion, rocket engines, secret weapons meant to turn the tide of war. But a few, including Thomson, stayed behind. The captured T-34 was still there, sitting quietly in the testing hangar, its olive paint dulled by months of dust and frost. Its engine had become a symbol among the technicians, a reminder of what they had seen and couldn't forget. The orders were clear. All further work on Soviet designs was to cease. The Reich was no longer interested in foreign inferiority, but Thomson couldn't let it go. Late at night, when the workshops were silent, he returned to the T-34 and started the engine again. The diesel coughed, then rumbled to life as it always did. The steady vibration filled the hangar, echoing against the concrete walls. It was alive, unyielding, indifferent to ideology. He took detailed notes, more for himself than for the military, about the practicality of Soviet design. He recorded how the engine's low-revving torque handled terrain that would stall German tanks, how its air filters tolerated sand and mud, how even after thousands of hours of use it ran without seizing. His reports went nowhere, buried under paperwork that celebrated new Panther and Tiger prototypes. But word of the tests had quietly spread through the German technical community. Engineers whispered about the Soviet miracle engine that had embarrassed the Reich's best. Some didn't believe it. Others dismissed it as propaganda. Yet among the mechanics and frontline crews, those who had faced the Russian winter firsthand, there was no doubt. They knew the truth. On the Eastern Front, reality was already proving Thomson right. As spring thawed the battlefields, new offensives began. And again, it was the T-34 leading the charge. German reports from Kursk told the same story. Soviet armor arriving faster, maneuvering farther, surviving longer. Many German tanks never even made it to the battlefield. Their engines overheated, their transmissions seized, their components failed under the strain. Meanwhile, the Soviet tanks rolled forward in clouds of dust and diesel smoke. The difference wasn't just numbers, it was endurance. The T-34 didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to work. Back in Kummersdorf, Thomson began to draw parallels between the engine and the soldiers who used it. The Soviet tankers weren't engineers. They weren't trained specialists. They were farmers, factory workers, students, ordinary men operating extraordinary machines. The T-34's simplicity was what made them unstoppable. Its engine didn't demand expertise. It demanded will. That summer, Berlin called for new designs. Faster, stronger tanks to replace the aging Panzer IV. German engineers scrambled to deliver. They produced marvels. The Panther, the Tiger II, machines of terrifying power and exquisite complexity. Yet Thomson couldn't help but notice how fragile they were in comparison. The Panther's Maybach engine overheated easily. The Tiger II's weight strained its transmission. These were works of art, yes, but they were unsuited for the war that was actually being fought. He wrote one final private note in his journal. "We have built monuments. They have built weapons." When Allied bombers struck Berlin that autumn, the Kummersdorf facility was partially destroyed. Thomson was evacuated, and the T-34 was left behind in a damaged hangar, half buried in rubble. When the power failed, its engine was silent for the first time in months. Yet even then, it seemed to rest, not die. Months later, when Soviet troops reached Kummersdorf in 1945, they found the wreckage of German machinery scattered everywhere. Amid the ruins stood the captured T-34, its armor scorched but intact. A Red Army mechanic examined it, smiled faintly, and climbed aboard. Minutes later, the diesel engine roared to life once more. It had outlasted them all. When the Soviet soldiers rolled into Kummersdorf, they found what had once been the pride of German engineering reduced to wreckage. The testing halls were gutted, the air heavy with soot and the stench of burnt oil. Broken machines littered the ground, shattered Panther transmissions, disassembled aircraft engines, and rusting prototypes that had never seen combat. But in one corner of the compound, half buried under debris and ash, sat the familiar silhouette of a T-34. It bore the marks of months of captivity, chipped paint, welded scars, a faded red star barely visible beneath layers of grime. A Soviet mechanic climbed onto the hull, brushed away the dust, and found the control levers still in place. Inside the engine compartment, the V2 diesel block waited like a heart paused mid-beat. When they primed the fuel lines and turned the crank, the engine coughed twice and came roaring back to life. The men cheered, even after everything. After months in enemy hands, after bombings, after being buried under stone and metal, the machine still lived. The same sound that had stunned German engineers now echoed over a battlefield that no longer belonged to them. That engine, more than any weapon, symbolized the endurance of the Eastern Front. While Germany's war machines had been conceived in marble offices and built for parade grounds, the Soviet engine had been born in dirt and fire. Its creators had known exactly what it needed to be. Not elegant, not flawless, but relentless. When Soviet intelligence reviewed the captured German reports, they were both surprised and amused. The files were filled with grudging admiration, descriptions of primitive excellence, functional genius, and remarkable resilience. In their meticulous handwriting, the Germans had unintentionally written a tribute to the very thing they had underestimated. The T-34 from Kummersdorf was repaired and returned to service with the Red Army. It fought again, joining a mechanized column advancing west toward Berlin. To the men who crewed it, it was just another tank, one of thousands. But its past was known to the engineers who had tested it. They called it the one that survived captivity. As it crossed into the ruins of Germany, the irony was complete. The same machine that German scientists had once examined with contempt now rolled through their homeland under a red flag. Its engine still rattled, still leaked oil, still smoked on startup, but it moved forward, tireless as ever. In the months that followed, captured German technicians were questioned by Soviet officers about their experiments. Some admitted they had been astonished by the T-34's performance. Others refused to speak. One of them, when asked whether they had learned anything from it, replied bitterly, "We learned that we built machines for pride. You built machines for war." The Soviet officer smiled. "And whose machines are still running?" The V2 engine's story didn't end with the war. It became the backbone of post-war Soviet tank design, evolving but never losing its essence. Variants powered the T-44, the T-54, and even the T-72 decades later. Living proof that the philosophy born in the crucible of 1941 had endured. For the Germans who survived, that memory lingered long after the last shots were fired. Thomson himself, the man who had overseen the Kummersdorf tests, was captured by Allied forces in 1945. He spent years in debriefings and reconstruction efforts, but he never forgot that engine. In his later writings, he described it not as a marvel of technology, but as a reflection of a nation's spirit, a heart that beats even when frozen. The T-34 from Kummersdorf was eventually retired in 1946, its hull patched and its engine still functional. It was placed in a museum outside Moscow, where visitors marveled at its history. Few realized that inside its thick steel walls rested a story of irony, admiration, and defeat. A story of how one humble engine had quietly humiliated the mightiest engineering empire in Europe. And on cold winter mornings, when museum workers turned the key and the diesel engine rumbled awake, that same echo filled the air. The sound that once made German engineers laugh, then stare, and finally respect. It was the sound of endurance. By the winter of 1946, the world had changed. The guns were silent, the cities in ruins, and the great war machines of Europe lay rusting in forgotten fields. But the legend of the T-34 lived on, and nowhere more vividly than in the laboratories and classrooms of the engineers who had once tried to destroy it. In the ruins of Germany, former Wehrmacht mechanics, now working under Allied supervision, spoke quietly of the engine that had defied them. The Americans and British listened with interest. They had faced the T-34 on the battlefield too, and they wanted to know what had made it so resilient. When they read the captured Kummersdorf reports, they were astonished. For all their own industrial might, they realized the Soviets had mastered something fundamental: simplicity without weakness. Across the Iron Curtain, in Soviet factories that were now rebuilding faster than anyone thought possible, engineers refined the lessons of the war. The V-2 diesel was improved, but never replaced. It became the standard for a generation of tanks, the beating heart of the Red Army's armor. Workers in Kharkov and Nizhny Tagil spoke of the engine with a kind of reverence. They knew its story, how it had started in the cold when nothing else could, how it had carried victory through the snow and mud of 1,000 battlefields. Meanwhile, in the West, the fascination turned to imitation. British engineers studying post-war tank development referenced the T-34's diesel system as an example of functional excellence. American designers noted its aluminum block and its unique air filtration, recognizing how much more efficient it had been under combat conditions. Even as the world divided politically, every army quietly acknowledged the brilliance of that Soviet design. Back in Moscow, the T-34 from Kummersdorf was disassembled for display. Its engine was placed on a metal stand, polished and labeled, a relic of both triumph and irony. Visitors would stare at the block of steel and aluminum, unable to grasp how something so plain could have humbled an empire of precision. But to the old mechanics and tankers who passed by, it was instantly familiar. The smell of diesel, the soot on the casing, the memory of a sound that once meant life. One retired Soviet engineer, who had helped design the original V-2 before the war, visited the museum in 1947. Standing before the engine, he ran his hand across its cooling fins and smiled faintly. "They tested it," he said softly to a young guide. "They tried to break it, didn't they?" The guide nodded. "Yes, in Kummersdorf." The old man chuckled. "And it started again, of course." Outside the museum, snow was falling, the same kind of dry, biting snow that had blanketed the Eastern Front years before. For a moment, he could almost hear it again, that low, rhythmic diesel rumble rising through the wind, the promise that no cold could silence it. In Germany, Thomson, now working as a civilian consultant under Allied authority, received a translated Soviet journal article one morning. It discussed post-war tank modernization and included a small note about continued refinement of the proven V-2 engine design. He read it in silence, recognizing the name instantly. The Soviets had not changed course. They had doubled down. He closed the report and looked out over the destroyed factories around him, the ghosts of an industrial empire that had once laughed at the crude Soviet diesel. And now, that crude diesel was the standard by which others measured reliability. He wrote in his personal notebook that evening, "It was not the strongest engine, nor the fastest, but it was the most alive. We built machines that demanded obedience. They built one that forgave imperfection, and that is why it endured." The war was over, but the lesson lingered, engraved not in steel, but in humility. By 1948, the T-34's legend had already taken on a life of its own. Across the ruins of Europe, soldiers and engineers alike spoke of the tank that never stopped. In Soviet propaganda films, it became the symbol of endurance and victory. But behind the myth, there was still a very real machine, one whose power came not from slogans, but from the engineering decisions forged in the harshest realities of war. In Kharkov, the birthplace of the T-34's V-2 engine, production lines were running again. The same factory that had been bombed and evacuated in 1941 was now humming with new life. Workers in oil-stained uniforms assembled engines almost identical to those that had powered the tanks to Berlin. Each one was tested in a freezing chamber before shipment, not out of ritual, but out of habit. The Soviets knew their machines would have to work in any weather, under any conditions. The T-34 had set that standard forever. In Germany, a very different scene unfolded. The Allied powers had divided the country, and both sides, East and West, were racing to rebuild and rearm. In the Soviet zone, captured German engineers were put to work designing diesel engines inspired, ironically, by the very one they had once mocked. In the Western zone, British and American analysts were publishing quiet technical studies on Soviet tank reliability and field maintenance. The conclusions were the same everywhere. The T-34 had redefined the concept of wartime engineering. Thompson, living now under occupation, watched these developments with a strange mix of pride and melancholy. He had seen the T-34's heart up close. He had heard its voice in the dead of winter, felt its heat against the frost. It was, in a sense, the machine that had broken his faith in German invincibility, and perhaps saved him from the illusion of perfection that had doomed his country. He spent his later years teaching mechanical design at a technical institute. His students, most too young to remember the war, were fascinated by stories of aircraft and rockets. But when Thompson spoke of lessons that truly mattered, he always returned to that winter of 1942, to the moment when an enemy tank had started in temperatures that killed their own machines. Perfection, he told them, is fragile. Reliability is power. Meanwhile, the T-34 itself continued its march through history. It fought in Korea, in the Middle East, in dozens of conflicts where conditions were brutal and resources scarce. The same V-2 engine, often patched, repaired, and rebuilt, kept running. Soldiers who had never heard of Stalingrad or Kursk learned the same truth German engineers had discovered years before. It would start when nothing else would. In 1949, a group of British military observers visited a Soviet exhibition in Prague. Among the tanks displayed was an older T-34 model, one that bore a faint inscription in German near its engine mounts, markings that identified it as the same vehicle once tested in Kummersdorf. The observers noted the irony in their reports. A tank once studied by the Wehrmacht now stood proudly as a trophy of Soviet engineering, and when the Soviets started its engine for demonstration, the familiar deep growl filled the hall. That same diesel rhythm that had haunted the cold fields of Russia, that had shamed the perfectionists of Berlin. The British officers exchanged quiet glances. They didn't need an explanation. That sound alone told the story. Back in his home workshop, Thompson read about the Prague exhibition in a trade journal. There was a photo of the engine. His engine, in a sense. He traced the lines of its casing with his finger, remembering the frost-bitten mornings when it first roared to life before their disbelieving eyes. He smiled faintly. The war was long over, but the memory of that machine, the one that had taught him humility, remained clear as ever. "They built for the world as it is," he murmured to himself. "We built for the world as we wished it to be." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the roads. Somewhere, far away, another T-34 engine rumbled to life, a low, steady heartbeat against the cold. By the early 1950s, the T-34 had become more than a tank. It was a legend. Across continents and decades, its engine continued to roar in deserts, jungles, and mountains far from the frozen plains where it had first proved itself. Yet the story of its endurance and the astonishment it inspired in German engineers years before was remembered by those who had seen it with their own eyes. In the Soviet Union, engineers proudly referred to the V-2 as the heart that never froze. Every generation of tank designers who followed understood what it represented. Not technological superiority, but resilience, adaptability, and practicality. It was the very embodiment of the Soviet approach to war. Win not through elegance, but through endurance. At the Kubinka Proving Grounds near Moscow, a small group of historians and engineers curated an exhibition dedicated to capture German technology. Next to the monstrous engines of the Tiger and Panther stood a modest display. A weathered V-2 diesel block, scarred but functional. A small plaque beside it read, "Captured in Kummersdorf, 1943, tested by German engineers, survived all tests." Visitors rarely lingered there long, drawn instead to the sleek German machines that symbolize power and precision. Yet for those who paused and listened, guides would tell the story of the winter when the Germans laughed at a crude Soviet tank, until they saw what it could do in the cold. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, Thomson grew old quietly. He never published his wartime notes, though they remained in a worn leather folder on his desk. Occasionally, he lectured on design theory, always emphasizing simplicity as the foundation of durability. His students, unaware of the full story, would later find his private journals and discover the truth. The man who had once helped design German armor had spent the rest of his life teaching the lesson of the T-34. In one of his final entries, written in 1952, Thomson reflected on that frozen morning when he first heard the Soviet diesel come to life. "I did not know it then," he wrote, "but we were listening to the future." That engine was not just built for tanks, it was built for survival, for a people who refused to die. Ours was a nation of perfectionists. Theirs was a nation of survivors. And survivors always win far away. The T-34s still rolled on. Some were now stationed in Eastern Europe under new flags, guarding a world divided by ideology, but united in memory of the war that had nearly consumed it. Their engines still started with that familiar cough and growl, unchanged, uncomplaining, eternal. In Korea, T-34s thundered through mud and snow once again, their silhouettes familiar to every soldier who saw them. Western observers reported that even after years of service, the tanks were astonishingly reliable. The same story repeated itself. No matter the climate, no matter the fuel, the T-34s ran. Mechanics joked that they could bury one for a year, dig it up, and it would start before their trucks did. Decades later, when historians pieced together the fragments of wartime research, the notes from Kummersdorf resurfaced. The German engineers' astonishment, their reluctant admiration for the peasant engine, was preserved in every page. What had once been a secret embarrassment had become a testament to respect. At a museum in Moscow, the T-34 from Kummersdorf was restored in full by 1960. When technicians started the original engine for the first time in years, it roared awake, the same steady heartbeat echoing through the hangar. Visitors fell silent as the walls vibrated softly with its rhythm. For a moment, it was as if history itself was breathing again. The curator, an old Soviet mechanic who had served in 1943, nodded with quiet satisfaction. "It still starts," he said simply. "Of course it does." Outside, snow fell over the city. The same bitter, endless snow that once stopped armies, but never stopped that machine. The Germans had tested it, doubted it, even mocked it. But when the frost came, and their engines froze silent, the T-34 still moved. And in that moment, when in that frozen, diesel-scented dawn, the balance of power in the war had shifted forever. Because while others built for power, the Soviets had built for endurance. And endurance always outlasts pride. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.